I thought I was just a cleaner who couldn't resist organizing books. Every night in Mr. Lane's vast library, I dust the shelves and silently rearrange his collection, leaving little reading suggestions by his chair, like literary breadcrumbs. I was sure no one noticed my midnight librarianship. Then he called me to his study and said the words that made my blood run cold. "I know what you've been doing." In that moment, I knew my life was over. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, what's a book that changed your life? And if stories about hidden talents, second chances, and the magic of literature speak to you, follow this page so you don't miss the next one. The Lane estate was the kind of place you read about in novels, sprawling, intimidating, and filled with more money than most people see in a lifetime. I'd been working there for 6 months as part of the night cleaning crew, and I still felt like an intruder every time I walked through those marble halls. My assigned area was the library, and calling it a library was like calling the ocean a puddle. 3 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, rolling ladders, reading nooks with leather chairs that probably cost more than my car, and a collection that would make university librarians weep with envy. Mr. Lane, the owner, was rumored to have over 50,000 books. The problem was he had no system. I discovered this on my first night when I was dusting the philosophy section and found a cookbook wedged between niche and dirt. A romance novel sat next to a biography of Einstein. First editions of Dickens were scattered across different floors like someone had thrown them from a helicopter. It was literary chaos, and it made my English literature degree cry. I'd graduated from State University 3 years ago with a degree in English literature and dreams of working in publishing or academia. But dreams don't pay student loans, and the job market for English majors was about as welcoming as a locked library. I'd applied to dozens of publishing houses, literary agencies, and university positions. The responses were always the same. "We're looking for someone with more experience," or "we've decided to go with another candidate." The few interviews I'd gotten had ended with polite rejections and suggestions to keep building your portfolio. Meanwhile, my student loan payments were due every month. My rent wasn't going to pay itself, and my savings account was approaching zero with alarming speed. When my roommate mentioned that her cleaning company was hiring for night shifts, good pay, flexible hours, no experience required, I swallowed my pride and applied. "It's temporary," I told myself as I filled out the application, "just until something better comes along." That was 18 months ago. My parents, both working blue-collar jobs, tried to be supportive. "You're gaining life experience," my mother would say during our weekly phone calls. "And you're still reading, still learning. The right opportunity will come along." But standing in that magnificent library, every night, surrounded by more books than most people see in a lifetime, felt like a special kind of torture. Here I was, someone who'd spent 4 years studying literature, who'd written a senior thesis on the evolution of the unreliable narrator, who could discuss the themes in Toni Morrison's work for hours, and I was being paid to dust the spines of books I'd killed to have time to read. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was probably the most overqualified cleaner in the city, working in the most underorganized library I'd ever seen. I tried to ignore it at first. I was there to clean, not to judge a billionaire's organizational skills. But every night, as I dusted and vacuumed around the beautiful disorder, it bothered me more. These books deserved better. They deserved to be found, to be read, to be loved. So, I started small, just moving a few books to where they belonged, putting all the Shakespeare together, grouping the poetry, creating a small section of contemporary fiction that actually made sense. Then I got bolder. I noticed that Mr. Lane had a reading chair, a massive leather armchair positioned near the tall windows with a side table that always held whatever book he was currently reading. The books changed every few days, and I began to pay attention to his tastes. He read everything: literary fiction, biographies, science texts, philosophy, even the occasional mystery novel. One night, I found him reading a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The next evening, I left. Go set a watchman beside his chair, along with a small note written on library cardstock I'd found in a desk drawer that read, "If you enjoyed revisiting Scout as a child, you might find her as an adult equally compelling, though perhaps more complex a fellow reader." I signed it that way because I didn't dare use my real name. If he complained to the cleaning service, I needed plausible deniability. The book disappeared. The next night, encouraged, I continued my secret curation. When I found him reading Murakami, I left the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle with a note about magical realism. When he finished a biography of Churchill, I suggested The Guns of August for more insights into wartime leadership. Each book disappeared. Each note vanished. And slowly, I began to see changes in the library itself. Books were being returned to shelves in the sections I'd organized. The K house was becoming order, one small area at a time. I told myself he probably didn't even notice. Rich people had staffed for everything. Maybe someone else was moving the books, following some system I didn't understand. But deep down, I hoped he was reading my recommendations. I hoped that somewhere in this vast cold mansion, someone was discovering new stories because of my midnight librarianship. Gerard Lane was a legend in the tech world, and a ghost in his own home. I'd been working at the estate for 6 months and had seen him maybe 5 times, always from a distance. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with dark hair that looked like he ran his hands through it when he was thinking, and the kind of intense focus that made you feel like he could see through walls. The other staff members spoke about him in whispers, and none of it was particularly encouraging. He fired the last librarian for moving a single book without permission, didn't even give her a chance to explain, just had security escort her out. He once made a chef redo an entire dinner party menu because the salad course was served on the wrong plates. The man notices everything and forgives nothing. The stories painted a picture of someone brilliant but impossible, successful but isolated. He built a tech empire worth billions, but according to the staff, he trusted no one and seemed to like even fewer people, which made my secret book organizing feel increasingly dangerous. Every night, as I carefully moved volumes and left my little notes, I imagined the conversation where I'd have to explain myself. "Well, Mr. Lane, I know you didn't ask for my opinion, but I thought you might enjoy some Toni Morrison after finishing that James Baldwin biography." It would be a very short conversation ending with my immediate termination, but I couldn't stop myself. The library was too beautiful, too full of potential to leave in chaos. And the books I recommended kept disappearing, which had to mean something. I began to notice other things too. The reading chair was always positioned to catch the best natural light during the day. There were reading glasses on the side table, expensive ones, with a prescription that suggested someone who spent a lot of time with books. Sometimes I'd find multiple bookmarks scattered around as if he was reading several books simultaneously. This wasn't someone who collected books as decoration. This was someone who actually read them, who lived with them, who needed them. One night, I found a notebook beside his chair filled with handwriting I assumed was his. The pages I could see contained what looked like book notes, quotes, thoughts, reactions to whatever he was reading. The handwriting was precise, but hurried, like someone trying to capture ideas before they escaped. I didn't read it. That would have been a violation too far. But seeing it made me feel less alone in my literary obsession. Somewhere in this mansion was another person who thought books were worth taking notes about, worth having conversations with, even if those conversations were one-sided. It made my secret curation feel less like trespassing and more like collaboration. 3 weeks into my unauthorized library reorganization project, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was shelving some poetry I'd found scattered across 3 different floors when I noticed something odd. The books I'd been recommending weren't just disappearing. They were being returned to specific spots. Not random places, but carefully chosen locations that suggested someone was building their own organizational system. The Toni Morrison I'd suggested after he read James Baldwin was now shelved with other African-American literature. The Barbara Tuchman history I'd recommended was grouped with other narrative nonfiction. Someone was not only reading my suggestions, but integrating them into a larger collection strategy. Emboldened by this evidence that my recommendations were being appreciated, I began leaving more detailed notes. Instead of just suggesting books, I started explaining connections between authors, themes that linked different works, historical contexts that might enhance understanding. When I found him reading 1984, I left Brave New World with the note about dystopian literature and how Orwell and Huxley had imagined different but equally terrifying futures. When he finished a biography of Marie Curie, I suggested The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks with thoughts about science, ethics, and the stories we tell about discovery. My notes grew longer, more personal. I found myself sharing not just what books he might enjoy, but why they mattered. what they'd meant to me, how they connected to larger conversations about humanity and art and the way we live. I was having the literary conversations I'd always dreamed of, even if they were completely one-sided. Then, one night, I found something that made my heart stop. Beside his reading chair was a new notebook, different from the one I'd glimpsed before. This one was open to a page that was clearly meant for me to see. In that same precise handwriting, someone had written to my mysterious librarian. "Your recommendations have been extraordinary, your insights thoughtful and illuminating. I find myself looking forward to discovering what you'll suggest next. Thank you for helping me see my own collection with new eyes, a grateful reader." I stared at the note for a full 5 minutes, my hands shaking as I held my dustcloth. He knew he'd known all along, and instead of being angry, he was grateful. I looked around the library with new eyes, suddenly aware that this wasn't just my secret anymore. Somewhere in this vast house, someone was paying attention to my work, appreciating my passion, engaging with my ideas. For the first time since I'd started working at the estate, I didn't feel like an intruder. I felt like a collaborator. That night, I left a longer note than usual along with my recommendation. I suggested The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and I wrote about the magic of libraries, about books that find their readers, about the way stories can create connections between strangers. I signed it for the first time with my real name, Carrie. The call came on a Tuesday morning just as I was getting home from my shift. I'd been working at the estate for 7 months, and my secret correspondence with Mr. Lane had been going on for nearly 2 months. I'd grown comfortable with our literary exchange, even bold enough to occasionally disagree with his reading choices in my notes. "Miss Michaels," the voice on the phone was crisp, professional. "This is Margot, Mr. Lane's personal assistant. He'd like to see you in his study this afternoon at 2 p.m. My blood turned to ice water. "I'm sorry, what?" "Mr. Lane would like to meet with you today at 2 p.m. The address is— I know the address," I said weakly. "Can I ask what this is about?" "He'll explain when you arrive. Please use the main entrance." The main entrance, not the service door. I'd been using for months. This was serious. I spent the next 4 hours in a state of panic. He knew about the books. That much was clear from our note exchange. But maybe he'd finally decided it was inappropriate. Maybe someone had complained. Maybe I'd crossed a line with one of my recommendations or comments. I thought about the note I'd left the night before along with a copy of The Book Thief. I'd written about the power of words, about how books could survive even when everything else was destroyed. Had that been too personal, too presumptuous? I changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on a simple black dress that seemed appropriate for either a job interview or a funeral. Given my current situation, it could be either. The main entrance to the Lane estate was even more intimidating than I'd imagined. Marble steps led to massive oak doors that probably weighed more than my car. I rang the bell and waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Margot turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "Miss Michaels, right on time. Mr. Lane is waiting for you in his study." She led me through halls I'd only seen in darkness, past rooms filled with art that belonged in museums. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and slightly cold, like a very elegant hotel where no one actually lived. The study was different. Smaller than I expected, lined with books, filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that suggested someone actually worked there. There were papers scattered across a massive desk, coffee cups that hadn't been cleared away, and reading glasses in at least 3 different locations. And there, rising from a chair by the window, was Gerard Lane. He was taller than he had seemed from a distance, and his eyes were the kind of dark brown that seemed to notice everything. He looked tired, I realized, in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. "Miss Michaels," he said, and his voice was warmer than I had expected. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." I perched on the edge of a leather chair, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl called to the principal's office. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," he said. "I have some idea," I said quietly, "and I want to apologize. I know I overstepped. I shouldn't have touched your books without permission, and I definitely shouldn't have left notes. I couldn't help myself." He studied me for a long moment, and I prepared myself for the lecture about boundaries and appropriate behavior. Instead, he smiled. "Miss Michaels," Mr. Lane said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need to show you something." He picked up a tablet from his desk and tapped the screen a few times. "This is the security feed from the library. I've been watching you work." My stomach dropped. Of course, there were cameras. Of course, he'd been watching. I was about to be fired, possibly arrested for theft or destruction of property. But when he turned the tablet toward me, I saw something unexpected. The screen showed me from the night before carefully moving books, dusting shelves, and yes, leaving my note by his reading chair. But the way he'd edited the footage, it looked less like surveillance and more like documentation. "I've been watching you reorganize my collection for months." At first, I was annoyed. No one touches my books without permission. I was ready to have you fired. I winced, but he continued. "Then I started paying attention to what you were doing. You weren't just moving books randomly. You were creating systems, building connections, making the collection more accessible. And your recommendations." He gestured to a stack of books on his desk. "Every single one I'd suggested over the past 2 months. They've been extraordinary." "I'm sorry," I said again. "I know I shouldn't have." He said firmly, "Stop apologizing. You've done something remarkable here. You've taken a collection I'd accumulated but never properly organized and turned it into something functional. More than that, you've introduced me to books I never would have found on my own." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "Can I tell you something, Miss Michaels? Something I haven't told anyone else?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'm going blind." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my breath catch. It's a genetic condition, degenerative. I've known for 2 years that it was coming, but it's accelerating faster than the doctors predicted. I can still see, but reading is becoming difficult. The words blur together, especially in low light. I have maybe 6 months before reading becomes impossible. He turned back to face me, and I could see the pain in his eyes. Not physical pain, but the ache of someone facing the loss of something essential. Books have been my escape my entire life. When I was building the company, working 18-hour days, dealing with board meetings and hostile takeovers, I'd come home and read. It was the only thing that kept me sane, the only thing that felt real. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find words that seemed adequate. When the diagnosis came, I started buying books frantically. First editions, rare manuscripts, entire collections. I told myself I was preserving them, but really I was just hoarding, trying to surround myself with all the stories I might never get to read. He gestured toward the library beyond his study. 53,000 books, Miss Michaels and I was drowning in them. They were becoming a monument to everything I was about to lose instead of a celebration of everything I'd loved. Then you started organizing them. And more than that, you started talking to me about them. Your notes weren't just recommendations. They were conversations. You were sharing your passion, your insights, your love for literature. For the first time in months, books felt like friends again, instead of reminders of what I was losing. I finally found my voice. "Mr. Lane, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be interested because I have a proposition for you." He leaned forward, his expression intense but hopeful. "I want to offer you a job, not as a cleaner, as my personal librarian and reader. I want you to properly catalog and organize my collection. I want you to read to me, to help me experience books in a new way. I want you to be my eyes in the world of literature." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "I what?" The salary would be $150,000 a year, plus benefits, plus a housing allowance if you want to live on the estate. You'd have complete authority over the library, a budget for new acquisitions, and the freedom to organize the collection however you think best. My mind reeled. $150,000 was more than I'd made in the past 3 years combined. It was life-changing money. But more than that, you'd trust me with your collection. Miss Michaels, you've already proven yourself. You've treated my books with more care and understanding than I have. You've shown me connections I never saw, introduced me to authors I never would have discovered. You've reminded me why I fell in love with reading in the first place. He pulled out a folder from his desk. I've had my lawyers drop a contract. Take it home, read it over, think about it. But I hope you'll say yes. I need someone who understands that books aren't just objects. They're doorways, and you've already proven you know how to open them. I said yes before I even read the contract. 3 weeks later, I was standing in the library, my library now, with a team of professional catalogers, a new computer system, and a budget that made my head spin. Mr. Lane, Gerard, as he'd asked me to call him, had given me complete creative control over the reorganization project. But the best part happened in the afternoons when the catalogers went home, and it was just the two of us. I'd never read out loud to another adult before, but Gerard was a generous audience. He listened with the kind of attention that made every word feel important. When I read dialogue, he'd smile at the voices I gave different characters. When I reached a particularly beautiful passage, he'd ask me to read it again. We started with The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo because I thought he'd enjoy the storytelling structure. He was fascinated by the way the narrative unfolded, by the complexity of the characters, by the themes of identity and reinvention. I never would have picked this up on my own, he admitted during one of our sessions. I would have dismissed it as not for me. But you're right. It's brilliant. That became our pattern. I'd choose books that challenged his assumptions, that took him outside his comfort zone, that showed him new perspectives. We read literary fiction, poetry, and memoirs, classics he'd missed, and contemporary works that were reshaping the literary landscape. And we talked. Oh, how we talked about themes and characters, about the way authors used language, about how stories reflected and shaped the world around us, the conversations I'd always dreamed of having, the literary discussions I'd imagined in graduate school. They were happening every day in that beautiful library. Gerard was brilliant, insightful, and surprisingly funny. He had theories about unreliable narrators and strong opinions about the Oxford comma. He could quote Shakespearean sonnets from memory and had read every Agatha Christie novel at least twice. You know, he said one afternoon as I finished reading a particularly moving passage from Beloved, I used to think losing my sight would mean losing books forever, but this is different, better in some ways. When you read, I hear things I missed when I read silently. The rhythm of the language, the music in the words. Really? Really. And having someone to discuss the books with immediately, that's something I never had before. Reading was always solitary for me. This feels like community. A few weeks into our reading routine, Gerard sat down his coffee and looked thoughtful. Can I ask you something personal, Carrie? Of course. Where did this love for books come from? The way you talk about literature, it's not just casual reading. There is real depth there. I smiled, thinking back. My grandmother, actually, she was a librarian in a small town in Oregon. Every summer, my parents would send me to stay with her, and she'd let me help at the library. I was maybe 8 years old, stamping due dates and shelving picture books, thinking I had the most important job in the world. That sounds magical. It was. But the real magic happened at night. Grandma would make hot chocolate, and we'd sit in her living room, which was basically a second library, and she'd read to me, not children's books, but real literature. Steinbeck, Harper Lee, even some Dickens. When I got older, she'd stop every few pages and ask what I thought, like my opinion actually mattered. Gerard leaned forward, genuinely interested. She sounds wonderful. She was. She used to say that books were like people. Some you'd like immediately, some would grow on you, and some would challenge you in ways that made you better. She taught me that reading wasn't just entertainment. It was conversation with the greatest minds. In history. Is that why you studied literature? Partly, but also because I wanted to understand how stories work, why some books stay with you forever while others fade. I thought I'd become a professor or maybe work in publishing, help bring new voices to the world. I paused, remembering the optimism I'd felt walking across that graduation stage. What happened? Reality? I said with a rueful laugh. Turns out the literary world is a lot smaller and more competitive than I had imagined, and a lot less interested in hiring recent graduates with big dreams and small bank accounts. So, you ended up cleaning instead of curating. Yes. But you know what's funny? Working in your library, even as a cleaner, felt closer to my grandmother's world than any of those jobs I applied for. Being surrounded by books, even if I couldn't read them all, felt like coming home. Gerard was quiet for a moment. She'd be proud of you, I think. Your grandmother, you found a way to honor books even when the traditional paths were close to you. I hope so, I said softly. She always said, "The right book finds you when you need it most." I never thought that applied to jobs, too. 6 months into my new position, Gerard made another generous gesture. He'd noticed that my commute from across town was eating into my reading time and costing me a significant portion of my salary in gas and rent. "I have a proposition," he said one afternoon. "There's a guest cottage on the property that's been sitting empty for years. It's fully furnished, has its own entrance, and it's about a 5-minute walk from the library. Would you be interested in living there? I could adjust your salary to include housing as part of your compensation package." I was stunned. The cottage was charming, a small but comfortable space with a fireplace, a modern kitchen, and large windows that looked out over the estate's gardens. More importantly, it would allow me to save money and be closer to the work I loved. "Are you sure?" I asked. "That seems like too much. Carrie, you've transformed not just my library, but my entire relationship with books. Having you nearby means I can focus on literature instead of logistics. It's practical for both of us, and I thought you might like to live closer to the books." I moved in the following month. Living on the estate felt surreal at first, but it quickly became home. I could walk to work through beautiful gardens. I had my own space to retreat to, and I was saving enough money to finally start paying down my student loans aggressively. But the best part was watching Gerard rediscover his love of books. The sadness that had shadowed his eyes when we first met was gone, replaced with curiosity and excitement. He'd gotten a guide dog, a golden retriever named Dickens, and had started attending literary events in the city, using his new perspective to engage with books in ways he'd never considered before. "You changed my view of literature," he told me one evening as we finished the midnight library. "I thought losing my sight meant losing stories. Instead, it meant finding a better way to experience them." A year later, Gerard decided to open his library to the public. One day a week, we started hosting reading groups, author events, and literacy programs for local schools. The library that had once been a private treasure became a community resource, a place where people could discover the same magic that had brought us together. I still leave notes by his reading chair sometimes. Old habits die hard, but now, they're not secret recommendations from a mysterious librarian. They're messages between friends, between two people who understand that books aren't just entertainment or decoration. They're bridges between past and present, between different perspectives, between people who might never have found each other without the magic of a shared story. And every afternoon when I settle into my chair and open a new book, when I hear Gerard's footsteps and Dickens' gentle panting as they join me in our library, I'm reminded that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we read. Sometimes they're the ones we live. A beautiful story about hidden talents, unexpected connections, and the transformative power of literature. What book would you recommend to someone trying to fall in love with reading again? Share your suggestions in the comments below. If this story of books, second chances, and finding your calling touched your heart, please hit like and subscribe for more silent stories about discovering where you belong. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching.